Good evening and welcome to Conservative Home's final event of the day, co-sponsored with the Centre for Medicinal Cannabis. I'm Henry Hill, the Assistant Editor of Conservative Home, and we are here this evening to discuss the question of how the United Kingdom can become a world leader in the field of medical cannabis. Joining me to discuss this question is an outstanding panel. They'll introduce themselves in a bit more detail, but we have Rob Wilson, who is a former Cabinet Office Minister and CEO of Conservative Drug Reform Group. We have Tony Diver from the Daily Telegraph, Michael Abbott, who was the Chief Executive of Columbia Care, one of the biggest companies involved in this field in the United States, and Dr. Michael Soderberg, who is a Senior Clinical Lecturer at Imperial College, London. Now, in 2018, for the first time, medical cannabis products became legal in the United Kingdom. But, sorry, Mark, you just popped it up there. But for the first time in 2018, medical cannabis became legal in the United Kingdom. But unfortunately, prescription has not kept up with that reality. For a variety of reasons, which we're going to go into today, it still remains very difficult for people to access medical cannabis products legally via the NHS. Of course, that doesn't mean that people can't get hold of cannabis products, and millions of people do, because it isn't a drug that needs a big factory or a pharma company's laboratory. It doesn't even require a degree in organic chemistry and the complete works of Alexander Shulgin. You can buy it from your neighbor, you can grow it in your own home. So the questions we're going to be digging in today is, why, 2 years after legalization, are there still so many barriers to entry? How can we change this? And how can we build on this foundation to turn the United Kingdom into a world leader in this field? Now, we're going to kick off with Rob Wilson, who will introduce himself, and then we'll move down the panel. Then we're going to move on to a Q&A section. You can take part yourself. There should be a Q&A option available to you. Please do send us your questions. And then at the end, we're going to wrap up. Oh, we're also joined by Charlotte Caldwell, who just was not on the list, but is with us, who is a really high-profile grassroots campaigner and has actually been instrumental in driving the legal change that we've seen so far. So thank you for joining us, Charlotte. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Harry, and it's a great pleasure to join you this evening. And thank you to the CMC for sponsoring this event. My name is Rob Wilson. I'm a former Member of Parliament for 12 years and Minister in the Cameron and May governments, although I'm trying to forget about the May government bit of it. And I'm also the former CEO of the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, which is why I still have an interest in this particular area. Medical cannabis as a sector has a really big opportunity at the moment to move forward. COVID-19 is currently crushing Western economies, so governments around the world are going to be looking for industries where they can build back quickly and better to restore jobs and create wealth. Research and development, biotech, the green economy, innovative technology will be some of the big winners with the UK government, in my view. And there's no reason why a joined up, credible case for medical cannabis sector could not be made to government to ask for partnership. But it does face some significant challenges, as Harry was alluding to. The growth of the sector has been lower than expected. Overall, the industry has lacked real credibility. It's too associated with hocus pocus medicines and unsubstantiated claims about well-being products. Some products, particularly in the wellness area, have been found to be a bit what I would describe as iffy. Testing has shown them not to contain necessarily even what is claimed on the label. So it's not joined up, and it appears at some stages to be self-serving. For example, trying to work around long-established medical regulations because it thinks in some ways that it's different to other medicines. Well, here's the big news. It is not different, and it won't be treated differently. To do so might put people at risk, and no sensible minister will allow that to happen. There is obviously a sizable potential clinical market for medical cannabis, and not least in pain relief. 1.4 million people in the UK buy street cannabis for symptomatic relief, and they clearly believe it holds benefits for them. Many would probably move to a prescribed legal pharmaceutical product. However, the studies detailing the relevant efficacy and safety data necessary to further support, for example, NICE guidance, is just not there yet. And that's despite the fact the UK is home to GW Pharmaceuticals, one of the largest and most successful medical cannabis pharmaceutical companies, with approved and licensed products that have been through the process successfully, demonstrating to us all that it is possible. The question is, why has this not translated into the widespread investment in research and issuing of prescriptions in the UK? Having only one successful company does seem strange and suboptimal for the British economy. So what should happen? In my view, first, the sector needs to come together and find funds for research and development of clinical products. Second, it should identify a strong university to partner with for joint projects that would become the National Centre for Cannabinoid R&D. And thirdly, approach the NIHR to invest in joint projects to fund with the money made available already. And finally, ask the government for a one-off grant from one of its many funds supporting the coming out of the C-19 crisis so that we can restart the economy. Thanks, Harry. That's all I've got to say for now.
No problem. And next up, we have Michael Abbott. Michael, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Michael Abbott. I grew up in the UK. I was a police officer for 5 years when I left school. So I have the dubious history of actually having arrested quite a lot of people for possession of cannabis. And now, for the last 10 years, I have co-founded and been running with my partner, Nicholas Vita, one of the larger both medical and health and wellness cannabis companies in the United States. I'm going to try to keep my comments to just 2 minutes, which I think was what was asked. One of the most common questions I get in the UK is, why is it that we are in the United Kingdom not taking a leaf out of the books of several states, many states in the United States who've actually adopted both medical and adult use programs? And the answer is, I think that Europe is not going to see this as a backdoor to recreational cannabis or adult use cannabis. Europe is taking a much more, a much slower approach. It's more sophisticated in a certain way, and we'll come on to this later as to how we can sort of unjam the problems. In the United States, I think that because you have this preemptive issue between states and the federal government, where the federal government still does not recognize cannabis as legitimate, it's actually still a Schedule I drug in the same category as cocaine and heroin. The problem that you have is that the messaging has been confused. And so whilst we started as a company with a pharmaceutical orientation, we are now in the health and wellness business, but we've always centered around trying to make a pharmaceutical grade product. What started our company was that when we won our first license in a separate company that we set up in Washington, DC, we noticed that many people who were coming in to see us had HIV or full-blown AIDS. And instead of taking the sort of opiate protocols, which would be for neuropathic pain, which is a side effect of that disease, of that virus, people would actually buy cannabis off the street. But the problem that they had is that when they took opiates, it had all sorts of side effects, which they would have to go out and buy drugs to counteract out of their own pocket. Buying cannabis actually was a substitution for opioids and actually removed the fact that they would have to buy drugs to counteract these side effects. And we found that very intriguing. And so we started creating a database. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, longitudinal databases in the United States, if not in the world. And what we've seen very clearly, to the earlier point made by the last panelist, that we have a very clear data set now which supports the notion that we can treat this as a substitute drug. Again, though, I would emphasize that it has to be looked at from a precise medicinal standpoint. The notion of actually growing this in your basement, you're never going to get a dosable, titratable product which is consistent every single time. So where is this going in Europe right now? The stats that I've seen are that the European market is roughly in terms of revenues, 1/3 of the size of just the state of Arizona. The problem with that is that as a businessman, I'm looking at the United States as an area of exceptional growth. More and more states are onboarding programs. We're likely to see some federal move at some point. In Europe, it's very difficult to actually attract capital. So I couldn't agree more with the earlier panelists' comments that this has to come initially, I think, from government and from state funding, so to speak, as well as from university funding as well. The entrepreneurs are going to move in, I think, once the data set's there, once the regulations are there, once there's a clear pathway where we could actually spend money and see a return on that capital. And that sounds rather sort of sharp-tongued from an entrepreneur, but I think that's just the way in which people are looking at this. I'll just finish by saying that the Canadian producers of cannabis who were very, very active in Europe and particularly in the UK, as we've seen, have actually started to pull back significantly again, and it's because you have not seen a move in legislative adoption of these programs in any of the countries to any large extent.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Next up, we have Tony Diver. Tony, over to you.
Hi, I'm Tony Diver. I'm a journalist at the Daily Telegraph. My interest in cannabis and medicinal cannabis comes from writing about it over the last couple of years. So my first story that I wrote about medicinal cannabis was, in fact, with Charlotte and Billy back in 2018, when Billy, on his way back into the UK, had his bottles of medicinal cannabis oil confiscated at Heathrow Airport, and Charlotte then fought a big and successful campaign to have that oil returned to him so that he could, because he needed it. And we wrote about that at the time, and I've been writing about it ever since. I think it's one of the most interesting political stories, as well as a health story, because it speaks to a very interesting division among conservative politicians, many of whom the idea of talking about cannabis or using cannabis in the NHS is very difficult because it has this strong association with recreational use, which is sort of what Michael was talking about earlier. And I think that will remain a barrier to investment and research and successful entrepreneurship in the UK when it lacks a sort of public consciousness and a belief in it as an industry. You see, for instance, if you can compare medicinal cannabis research to other forms of medical research, life sciences, genome science. I mean, Matt Hancock today at Tory conference must have mentioned these industries and companies that were working in these fields, 10 times. Medicinal cannabis never comes up as a topic that Tory politicians are comfortable talking about. And I think that's problematic, partly because Rob's suggestion that these companies should go to the government and ask for funding and look for political backing, that I think there is a worry that Tory politicians will feel some resistance from the backbenchers and from some of their members over any form of cannabis, be it recreational, medicinal, or whatever. And so I think quite sensibly people in the UK who are interested in medicinal cannabis have tried to divorce the debate about medicinal use from the recreational debate as much as possible, and people try and have these debates entirely separately. I was going through Hansard earlier and looking at debates on cannabis over the last couple of years, and it's fascinating the number of times that a debate on medicinal access will get derailed by points about recreational use and vice versa. And I think it's probably helpful that we try and see them as totally separate things. And the regulatory landscape on the two things is totally different, obviously, because recreational use is entirely illegal in the UK, and medicinal use is technically legal if very difficult for people to get access to it, as I'm sure Charlotte will talk about. But I think that the public awareness of what cannabis is and how it's used in different ways is not particularly good. And so if I was looking at investing in cannabis and doing research in cannabis, which I'm not, I'm only writing about it, I would think about starting there. I also think, as a separate point, and not to confuse the matter even further, the CBD market in the UK doesn't help at all because, as Henry pointed out earlier, there is this huge array of products that claim to do lots of different things, and the regulatory landscape is quite permissive in the UK. So it means that you can put a big sign up in your coffee shop that says, do you want a squirt of CBD oil in your coffee and it will make you feel good? I don't think that association with cannabis lends itself especially to there being sort of widespread political support for government support for the industry. And I think that will probably continue to be the case. My interest and involvement in all of this has been mainly about the sort of access to medicinal cannabis for patients who are after it for various different reasons. So my knowledge of the sort of entrepreneurship and business side is less good, but if people are interested in the access question in the Q&A, more than happy to talk about that. And yeah, that's all I'd say.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Michael Sodergren. Michael?
Thank you very much. So my name is Michael Sodergren. I'm an academic clinician at Imperial College London. For the NHS, I work as a liver and pancreas surgeon. I'm also research director at MEC Life Sciences and one of the co-founders of Sapphire Medical Clinics, which is the first CQC regulated medical cannabis clinic, specially set up to evaluate patients as to whether it's appropriate for them to be trialed on medical cannabis. My interest in medical cannabis started on the research side. So one of my research interests is cancer biology. And we started doing some very interesting work in the lab and then set up a research program at Imperial, which has been really interesting and really academically fruitful. But then when the law changed almost 2 years ago now, it became clear to myself and some colleagues that patients weren't really going to be able to access medical cannabis, and not in the way that we would feel is appropriate for rolling out this medicine for potentially large volumes of patients. And so the reasons for that are quite simple. You know, no doctors have been trained in prescribing medical cannabis. It's not an undergraduate or postgraduate teaching curricula. For the vast majority of indications, medical cannabis is going to be prescribed as an unlicensed medicine. So that's the second reason. And that in itself makes many doctors apprehensive. They're not used to it. They're not able to look up doses, contraindications, and so on in the little book that we use, the BNF. And the third reason is that when medical cannabis was legalized, it came with some specific guidelines from NHS England and from MHRA. And so these meant that even with the best will in the world, and if you got yourself trained up, a single doctor would struggle to tick all of these boxes, as it were. And so I think it's important just to set the context for medical cannabis in the UK. We're in a completely unique situation. The medical profession has never been in this place before, where we are able to prescribe a medicine for potentially large volumes of patients. And, you know, Rob alluded to the CMC YouGov poll that suggested that 1.4 million people are already self-medicating for a diagnosed medical problem. And, you know, chronic pain is a diagnosis that is applied to over a third of the British population. So there's potentially large volumes of patients wanting to access these medicines that have not been through the traditional drug development pipeline. And so we've never been in this situation before. And that, of course, presents some really interesting opportunities. And I think that Britain is uniquely placed to be a leader in this field for a number of reasons. In part because we already have the NHS, and the way that our healthcare system is set up, it means that we are not going to go down the same route as has happened in the States and in Canada. And what is overwhelmingly likely to happen is that there's going to be much greater emphasis placed on data collection, on building the evidence base for medications, because that is the only route to having these medicines prescribed in large volumes for free on the NHS. And so that sort of incentive isn't there in the States, and it's not there in Canada and in other places where medical cannabis has been legalized. And so one of the reasons why we set up Sapphire Clinics was so that we could start this data collection and really record this clinical outcome data in a way that allows us not just to be able to get more information on treating individual patients, but to be able to build up our general knowledge and to be able to get drugs in part through this drug development pipeline, which is a traditional pharma route for modifications for cannabis. And so that's really important. And then, aligned with that, we have to have a framework through which we can make it easy for companies to conduct this kind of research, which will lead to further and more robust evidence base, and then in turn, drugs available to all those patients that need them on the NHS.
Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, Charlotte, over to you.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Charlotte Caldwell. I'm the mummy of Billy Caldwell. In June 2018, our campaign to access medical cannabis for Billy led to the law change in November, the 1st of November 2018 in the UK, to allow doctors to prescribe such products that Billy was on. I think from my perspective, sorry, I should say I'm actually also advocacy, patient and advocacy lead on the Centre of Medical Cannabis, who's hosting, sponsoring this panel today. I support a large group of chronically ill patients with a wide spectrum of conditions, anything from epilepsy to MS, fibromyalgia, PTSD, chronic pain. Those people come from a huge background, a wide spectrum of different backgrounds, anything from policewoman to a lawyer to an accountant to a doctor's child. I this last 4 years have heard it all. Absolutely every story you can mention. I'm very passionate about this medicine. Very passionate to get it available to as many patients as possible with a wide spectrum of conditions. And yes, we're all very aware that the UK is well known as a world leader in producing scientific and clinical research. Although to date that has been very, very limited, as we're all aware. I think where I'm at the moment and is with Dr. Snorgan, where we need the data. We need to start looking at gathering this data. We have, as a number of the other panelists have mentioned, 1.4 million patients in the UK accessing cannabis as a medicine. Some of that, those patients would be accessing it on private prescription. Some are accessing it from the black market, and some would be growing their own. But I think we need to start creating. Those are the people that we need to start involving and start creating the data and start setting up or trials. I think it is going to be rather difficult because again, our doctors, when they are going through and doing their doctorates and their university degrees, etc., to become doctors, they're not any education on cannabis medicine while they're doing that, and that is really a sad situation that we're left in. So one of the things I would like to encourage as well is somewhere within the government is that becomes part of the curriculum for our doctors, our student doctors that are now training. That needs to go onto the curriculum. It's really, really important, because cannabis medicine is going to be the future. But again, I'll go back to the data. I think this is really, really, really important. From my experience with having to battle for my child to access medical cannabis, which has been a 4-year-long battle, our doctors are not educated. They're not trained in this medicine, and therefore they are not going to prescribe. And I think, yes, they are unlicensed medicines, but even if they were licensed medicines, these doctors still need to be trained and they need to be educated. They want to learn. They're now getting curious about the medicine, and they do want to learn. But I think it's our government that now has a responsibility to actually put in place the correct learning and education, first and foremost, in our universities. And secondly, they need to start gathering the data. We can, if I even just took the group of patients that I support, which is a large group of patients, like I said, with a wide spectrum of conditions, if we even took that group of patients and looked at the data of how they were medicating themselves with cannabis. So, as I said, some of them are private prescription, some of them grow their own, and some of them access it from the black market. And I think the patients as well, might I say, is the patients that I speak to that are in my group that are accessing their medicine, whether it be growing their own or via the black market, those patients are actually getting, for example, an MS, 40-year-old MS patient, progressive, severe progressive MS. He's inside a very short space of time, literally within 6 years, he's went from a hard-working guy to he's sitting in a wheelchair, and he is completely and utterly depleted. He is accessing his medicine via the black market. He knows exactly what he can and cannot have. He is not accessing cannabis because he wants to get high. He is accessing cannabis because he actually wants to get some pain relief. And it's the only thing, after trying numerous cocktails of pharmaceuticals, that is actually giving him some relief. So I think, I think within government, there needs to be somewhere, if we can have some sort of department set up, that it's a task force, it's their task, it's their job to access these patients, whether it be the patients are, we've got to remember there's different ways of getting this medicine. So it's private prescription, it is growing their own, or it is black market. And I can tell you right now, I know the majority of these people, as I said, are not accessing this medicine to get high. They're accessing this medicine so they can actually live some sort of normal life, and it's to ease their suffering. But we need, that's what I would be proposing, is some sort of task force within our government that is set up that actually it is their job to actually access these patients, gather the data. How are you, how are you growing that medicine? How can we help? What is it growing in? What's the name of the plant? How can we help? How can we put that into a bottle of medicine where it would then maybe, go and help other patients via the prescribed route? It's still data. We need to get it. So I think data is, to me, clinical data is the way forward in this. And as I said, our doctors being trained.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so there's an awful lot to unpack. I think I'm gonna start, possibly, Tony, you've been covering this story for a number of years. Why do you think, after that initial burst of progress, that initial legalization, why did momentum peter out? We've discussed some of the objections that people raised towards medical cannabis in politics, but presumably they were there before 2018. So something happened, and then something stopped happening. What happened there? What took the momentum out of this?
Yeah, well, I think it's momentum in two different places, isn't it? It's that before then, what we saw was a building of political momentum. What we saw was essentially a U-turn from the Home Office and a change in attitude in the Home Office on the way that this drug should be scheduled. But now, actually, the onus has now been placed on individual doctors working within the NHS, and to some extent on structures that have been set up within the NHS to deal with these issues. So the RESCAS panel set up by the Department of Health, for instance, and various other sort of attempts by the Department of Health to unblock a logjam. I think actually, if anything, the issue is better known now than it was immediately before the law change. There are a lot of parents who are campaigning who've got epileptic children. There are people with chronic pain. I think the issue is fairly in the public domain, but the problem is now, rather than it being a very simple political issue which requires a law change which can be made in a department in an afternoon, what we now have is a much deeper, more structural issue, which Dr. Sodergren has already explained. The issue with doctors not knowing about how to prescribe it, with individual NHS trusts worrying about liability for unlicensed medicines prescribed, which go wrong, which is obviously always like that. Legal liability is always a concern for NHS trusts. With all of these issues aren't happening at the department level, at the political level. They're not happening in Parliament. They're happening in a sort of dispersed way across the entire system. So I think really, if anything, it's not that the political momentum has changed. It's just that the issue that's now being dealt with is so much more complicated and requires this really lengthy data collection process that everyone else has talked about in order to get over issues with supply.
Okay, I should just say I may, on the count of the size of the panel, just direct certain questions initially to certain panelists. If any of you want to come in on a question, just raise your hand so I can see you and I'll come to you. That's absolutely fine. Oh, and the hand goes up.
Yeah.
Rob.
Yeah, sorry. Just following up on that last answer. I think what happened in the case of the approval, it was political momentum that got that approval, as has been said. And it really stopped quite quickly when it disappeared back into the morass of what the NHS and the Department of Health and the trusts and NICE and all the other things all the hurdles you have to jump through to get anything approved as a drug. Because at the end of the day, the medical community, the NHS, etc., regard this as a drug that needs to be properly tested in all its elements before it's tried on a large number of human beings. So that is the thing that you just can't jump past, and that is the thing that is always going to hold this up, which is why you need a proper research and development program that the industry gets behind, not just the government. The government needs to play its part, and it can play its part with some funding and so forth, but also needs the industry to play its part as well, to provide its element of the funding as well, and to partner with other sectors as well.
Okay, and so that brings us, I think, quite nicely to our first question from the audience, which is a follow-up, which is a lot of you have spoken about the importance of data. So one questioner asks, why hasn't it happened already? It's been 2 years since there was a change in the law. Why is it that this data collection process hasn't already started? What are there serious barriers to that happening? Is there something that the government needs to do to make that easier? Is it a lack of action or coordination on the part of the industry? I suppose I'll start with you, Rob, as I'm talking to you already, and then maybe move over to Dr. Sodergren and anyone else who wants to come in.
I guess the big barrier to it has been partly political and partly financial. I think that money is playing a huge blocking role in this, because clinical trials of almost any description, if you get past phase 1, phases 2 and 3 start to get really, really expensive. And there hasn't been the will from the industry itself to fund all those clinical trials, certainly not in the UK anyway. Other parts of the world there are some countries that are showing that there's a bit of will, but money for clinical trials is the one thing. The other thing is that there are, as one of the previous speakers said, some serious problems with political will, particularly on behalf of a government that is focused on other issues. Let's put it that way. It's got, you know, COVID-19 on its plate. It's got still Brexit coming along, and maybe, you know, a medical cannabis industry is not really politically something that they're prepared to deal with at the moment. And that, again, without that will, it makes it much more difficult to get the momentum going again.
Okay, Dr. Michael, from the clinician's perspective, what's the hold up with the data collection?
I don't think there is a hold up. I mean, I think it's important just to emphasize that, you know, when the law changed, the medical profession on a whole were caught completely off guard, because this wasn't a process that had happened in consultation with the medical profession on the basis that these medicines, you know, hold promise for a variety of indications. This was a change in the law, as far as we understand, driven by successful campaigning for some very sick children whose lives depended on these medicines. And so when the law changed, the doctors on a whole were just completely unprepared for the consequences of that. So doctors are allowed to prescribe medical cannabis for whatever they feel is appropriate. But there was no, as far as I'm aware, long or significant consultation period on how this should be rolled out with the medical profession and so on. So the start to this process for the medical profession happened then. There wasn't significant, there was some, you know, silos of research happening before that, but there wasn't anything substantial. So, you know, that's when all of this started, and we're 2 years down the line, and 2 years is a very short period of time when it comes to clinical research. You know, under normal circumstances, when from the moment I get an idea to the point where I've written a grant proposal and that's been considered and funded, just that process of getting something funded takes over a year in most cases. And then you have setting up trials, running trials. This is a process which is very difficult to speed up. Having said that, there are many things that the government can do to help in this process, and they are doing, and there are some areas that they certainly have tried. So NIHR, which is where a lot of the research funding comes from in the UK, have had themed calls for cannabis-based medicines last year. There were 2 of them. So they were asking for research proposals for cannabis-based medicines to specifically fund those. But the process is still not easy, and it's not an issue of fast-tracking cannabis, because Rob is absolutely right. Cannabis-based medicines are to be evaluated in exactly the same way as every other medicine that we're prescribed. But there are ways, because we're in this situation that nobody thinks is satisfactory, there are ways that the government could certainly try to fast-track these processes, identifying, you know, a center as the one that we've spoken about by several of the panelists, being able to deliver that funding to them, and in many ways working with NICE, with the regulators, to say exactly what is it that we need to know as a priority, identifying those areas and funding those, and to get them done as quickly as possible, rather than this sort of reactive process with the clinical academic community, which is happening now, and which will give us the answers in due course, but that isn't a 2-year project. Okay,
Michael, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just, I'm going to say something a little bit provocative, and it's also going to be perhaps unworthy of coming out of my mouth, because I'm not a doctor. But having now been in this industry for almost 10 years, and I think it's safe to say that, not to sort of toot my own company's horn, but we were always known as that company that wanted to basically build a medical cannabis company, not an adult use cannabis company. And I think we're still known as that. And what I've learned over the years is that there are products out there, first and foremost, that do have a large enough bibliography of evidence that they do not have the same safety exposures of other drugs. You know, I could take Levesa, which is fish oil, for example. That never went through an FDA program, and that is sold and prescribed and reimbursed by drug companies all over the world. Aspirin, to my knowledge, never went through an FDA process. The second point I'd make is that there have literally been hundreds upon hundreds of clinical trials that have actually been studied and codified. There have been meta studies that have been published in journals around the world, including The Lancet, but other journals. JAMA just published an enormous meta study of studies. And I think that I think it's important to absolutely drive these decisions from a political standpoint with data. We need to have doctors like yourself behind this. We need to have educational programs in place to know what it is that you're actually prescribing for what. But in terms of getting to that point where you can do it, I would, again, with the greatest of respect of a typical clinical trial, I simply don't believe that you have to go to the same extent that you are necessarily going to, for example, with a drug that's designed to a vaccine for COVID, which has the potential for actually killing somebody if you get it wrong, versus a drug which, and again, I use this word bibliography, which is how the Germans have approached it. And they've actually implemented a program now where the drug is made available, and they have leapfrogged through the first stages of the typical clinical trial, which are typically all about safety. So not to suggest that this isn't, this is a multi-month process. It's not. It is a multi-year process. But I don't think we're looking at the same type of, 10 years of clinical trial. The last point I'd make is that why not go after the lowest hanging fruit? What do I mean by that? Let's look at the conditions which we know, as was said earlier by, I think it was either you, Michael, or maybe Robert, we know that people are using it for the most, which is chronic pain. It doesn't cure the pain, it is palliative, but it does significantly help, and it is a perfect substitution for a different, more expensive drug like an opiate, which has more side effect profiles than cannabis does.
Okay, perfect. I was going to come to you anyway, Charlotte. Charlotte, your hand went up there, please.
Yeah, I'd like to just follow on there a little bit on what Mike said, and I really feel during my battle to have Billy his keep him on his medical cannabis, we have had to be we've been exiled a number of times from our country in Canada and in Los Angeles, and during that time I used it to and I've had the privilege of talking to some of the most eminent doctors in the world that are experts in medical cannabis and experts in MS, epilepsy, etc. also. And there is a number of clinical trials that have already taken place around the world with a number of different medical cannabis products in a number of different conditions. And when I talk about the government setting up a task force to gather this data, I think this is what, not just from the 1.4 million patients in the UK, I think we need to be gathering the data from the licensed producers that have already carried out and are in the midst of doing clinical trials. And we need to share that. That needs to be brought into the UK, and that needs to be shared with our clinicians, because there you have, there's a number of medical cannabis products globally that have actually been through trials, and the data is there in black and white. So that could be shared with our medics. And what I'm saying, that again would lead to them becoming more comfortable at prescribing on the NHS for these chronically ill patients.
Okay, so you as a patient or rather a patient, somebody who represents patients, you think that you think there could be scope for expediting the process for some of these if you like, proven?
I do. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that our private prescribers in the UK, for people that are accessing medical cannabis via a private prescription, those people like Dr. Snorgan are in a prime position to actually now start collecting the data on patients that are accessing it, their medicine via private prescription. For example, children with epilepsy, patients with MA. I know Miguel has got a number of my patients are a number of his patients, MS, chronic pain, etc. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to then bounce that. All the hands are going up, but I was going to call anyway. This is brilliant. I'm going to bounce it back to Dr. Sodergren and then to Rob, who was quite strident at the beginning about the fact that there won't be an expedited process for medical cannabis. Dr. Sodergren, if you don't mind, I'm just going to draw in a question from the audience, which I think sort of ties in a little bit, which is somebody asked, given that some pharmaceutical medications that have already been approved have horrendous side effects, why do we accept these and then not, or appear very reluctant to accept these side effects that arise from cannabis? So for you as a clinician, given what the previous two speakers have said, why do you believe that the government needs to stick to the full development process when this is a product which has been around for a long time and has been used by a lot of people? For you, what's the importance of that process?
It's very straightforward, and this also goes to the point about Germany and how we're very different to Germany. The way that medicines are evaluated in the UK is very straightforward. It's very transparent. We understand the process. It's done by NICE, and essentially it's a cost effectiveness analysis. And so I'll go back to the example about chronic pain. NICE evaluated cannabis-based medicines in the context of chronic pain last year. They looked at all the highest levels of evidence from all the trials around the world, licensed and unlicensed, and the quality of that evidence is low or not very high, but it shows that there is no doubt that cannabis-based medicines work for chronic pain. They have efficacy. But the second part of the process in NICE is whether they are cost effective. And so that means you and I, as the British taxpayers, should we foot the bill for them? And that's also a relatively straightforward calculation. They use a threshold of 20 to 30,000 pounds per quality adjusted life year. That's the metric. And so when they did this calculation for chronic pain, they saw, yes, the medicines work, but they don't reach this cost effectiveness threshold yet. And so I have no doubt that they will for pain in due course. How will they do that? Well, we need better evidence and for the medicines to cost less. And this is in stark contrast to Germany, where in Germany, it was a political decision for the insurance companies to reimburse medical cannabis. They have not done a cost effectiveness analysis. And so unfortunately, unless the British government adopts a completely new model in which it becomes political decisions as to what medicines are funded on the NHS, I think this is the framework that we have to work within. And as I said, I have no doubt that cannabis-based medicines will be prescribed for free on the NHS in due course, but we need better data and they need to cost less.
Okay. Sorry, I've got to jump in here. How is it that NICE, and I'd love to see this, how could they have possibly come to a conclusion that a drug that has not gone through a clinical trial is more expensive than a drug that has had to have gone through a clinical trial? Does anyone on this panel know how much money GW Pharma has actually spent and what the cost of that drug is for that tiny population that they're actually treating with pediatric epilepsy? I mean, it is over, I think, $38,000 a year or something. I mean, how can cannabis even conceivably be more expensive where it hasn't gone through that same multi-year, tens and tens of millions of pounds of clinical trial process? I'm not arguing with you, Mikhail. I'm stunned that NICE would say, because to me, this whole issue is a health economics issue for governments. We have unions coming to us in America who have workers' comp claims where the workers go onto opioids and then 7% of them never come back to work because they become addicted. If you give them cannabis and they substitute, that number goes down to a tiny fraction. But the cost of the medicine itself, I'm having difficulty understanding how NICE came to that conclusion.
Okay, so I'd like
sorry,
to
can I come back quickly?
Yeah, I was going to say,
just
before I
very
lose all
quickly.
my authority as chair, I'd like to give you a chance to respond, and then I'd like to go over to Rob on the original question. No, it's absolutely fine. This is what debate's for, but it doesn't mean I have to stick my oar in every so often. So I'd like to give Dr. Sullivan a chance to respond, and then go to Rob.
Michael, I think I couldn't agree more that, on the face of it, it sounds, very, very strange indeed. What I would say is that the cost effectiveness analysis is publicly available using the formula that NICE use for all other medicines. So, and I don't think we can argue with that. But what I will say is that you raise a very important other point, which is this is how we evaluate all medicines in the UK, and there have been a lot of debate as to whether this is the right formula on a whole, not just for cannabis. Cannabis shouldn't be an exception, but on a whole, should we be looking at wider factors such as what you've raised, getting people off opiates, returning them to work? That is not something that that's used to determine whether medicines are available in the NHS, and I think it should be.
Okay, Rob.
Yes, thank you. Michael mentioned Germany. I'll just add to that very briefly to say that Germany's financial model is very different from the UK's in that Germany has an insurance system model, and the German government has made it accessible for people by ensuring that insurance companies pay for the treatments that are available. So that's the big difference, and why private prescriptions are on the public funding is going further and faster. On the issue that we're talking about, something has to be proven, and it's not proven by anecdotal evidence. And a lot of the evidence that comes forward from around the world is anecdotal evidence. And medicines work for some people, and often they don't work for other people, which is why you need standardized products that are properly tested and have gone through a detailed process. So yes, you do have to fulfill the regulatory requirements. And one of the things that is becoming more apparent because of COVID-19 is that something that's approved by the FDA, for example, is much more likely to be quickly approved in the UK or in the EU than ever before. So if there is drugs FDA approved now, cannabis drugs in the US, it won't be a massive trial to get them through in the UK, because it's much lighter touch than it was. Certainly that's my experience anyway. But no serious government is going to leapfrog the safety rules. So until the industry gets that out of its head, it is not going to progress successfully into building a very strong industry.
Okay, Michael, I'd like to again, my panel reading powers have yet to fail me. Michael, I'll give you a chance to come back on that, and then I'd like to include a follow-up, if you could just move, which is that you said in your opening remarks that because of the lack of regulatory progress, companies have been reluctant to invest, maybe have been drawing back their investment. Other panelists have suggested that one of the big sort of things holding up the development of the evidence base that's needed in this country is the fact that there's not sufficient private sector investment. So is there perhaps a chicken and egg situation going on where the regulatory environment is reducing incentives to invest and so on? And then I suppose the other thing we should touch on, because we've talked about a lot of this from the medical perspective, from your perspective, if the UK were to become a global leader, what would the advantages be? What would be the benefits to the United Kingdom of establishing itself in this space? That's quite a lot of stuff, but just do the chair's thing and pick your favorites. But over to you.
Well, I have to just make a very brief response to Robert's comment about safety. Again, I'm going to double down, triple down on this, and I'd love to send you the research that exists, the clinical trials that have actually taken place, the meta studies in highly reputable journals with academic medical institutions and universities around the world. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of these papers and trials and studies that are being done. We're treating right now in upstate New York at the Center of Discovery with Oren Davinsky, who is the principal investigator on the GW Pharma epilepsy drug, who's now chosen our drug to treat children under the age of 18 who have epilepsy in that center. And we're actually producing a drug which is undergoing and is almost completing the trial right now. And we're one of literally hundreds that are going on. So the work is there. The safety protocols are there. I agree with you, however, that these drugs have to be made consistently, and that is an issue. But when these drugs are made consistently, which there are many companies that do make them consistently, the safety protocols have been analyzed and analyzed and analyzed, and they will continue to be. But the work is there, and if I was sitting there as a regulator, I've got an abundance of absolutely reputable data that supports that. Just to answer, Charlotte, before you jump in, the question about business coming into the UK and spending money. Let's pull back the aperture a little bit here. Whether this is cannabis or making cars or whatever it may be, it doesn't matter. Any person in a very sort of unemotive way is not going to, as a businessman or businesswoman, put money into an environment where there is regulatory uncertainty. Now, you may be scoffing at that remark because here Nick and myself put a lot of money into an industry in the United States where there actually is a lot of uncertainty because there is this federal state disconnect. We felt comfortable within the confines of the state rules, and we went with state rules that were actually very, very stringent. We like regulatory environments that are very stringent because they're very clear, they're very unambiguous, and you can actually make capital investments based upon that. If they're nebulous, if they're wishy-washy, if it allows other competitors to come in, if it allows people to come in and actually undermine the credibility of the industry, which has happened in certain states, like, for example, historically in places like California and elsewhere, they're not really historically markets that you're interested in. The UK right now is a little bit of a blank canvas. It's starting to be painted on. But again, this has to come first. But the order is exactly, I think, how all the panelists are agreeing. You start with the data, you get the buy-in from the medical community, then you move on to the political class and you say, write the rules that are going to essentially be consistent with that data. At that point, that's when you start bringing in the external capital. Why would the UK want to do this? I agree with what Charlotte made at Charlotte's comment at the beginning of this panel. UK has an incredible and rich history in scientific research. And I mean, listen, I'm British, my whole family are doctors. I would love nothing more than the UK to become a leader in this area. It's a little bit nostalgic, that comment, but I think there's real benefit economically as well to the economy to become a leader.
Okay, Charlotte, and then Tony.
Yeah, can I just ask Mike and Miguel? Okay, so this is for Mike and Miguel. Yeah, sorry. So first of all, Mike, so the clinical trial that is happening with Oren Davinsky on children with epilepsy, could you explain to me and maybe to Miguel that clinical trial, that's what, you know, a broad outline just of how that's working in the first instance. And then Miguel, if you could actually just, what's the difference? What I'm trying to say is the difference between the clinical trial that Mike is carrying out with Oren Davinsky in the US to a clinical trial here in the UK. Because surely what I'm trying to say, the second thing is if that clinical trial in the US is successful and the papers are published and everybody's happy and the product's happy, why could that particular product not be prescribed then on the NHS? Because what I would like to see is global data sharing and global data sharing of clinical trials, because I think it's the only way, well, it's not the only way, but one of the ways that we're going to move this forward.
Okay, well, I think Rob mentioned earlier on that actually things that are approved in the US, it is now much easier to get them approved. If we could go to Michael and Michael swiftly, please, and then on to Tony. So,
yeah, gentlemen. I mean, Rob hit the nail on the head. That the problem is that our little clinical trial in upstate New York is, as far as I'm aware, it's not going to receive a stamp from the FDA. and I think that's the issue. We will get it'll be a study, it'll be a trial. It will follow all of the possible protocols that we can. It's being run by qualified clinicians and doctors, and our chief scientific officer has been Dr. Rosemary Mazanet has actually been running it from our vantage point. But my understanding is it's not going to, it's not going through an FDA process formally, and so therefore it would really be up to the MHRA if they wanted to accept that data or not.
And can I ask?
No, I'm sorry. Michael, what's the difference between that? To go back to the original question,
Yeah.
Charlotte, what's the difference between that and a UK medical trial?
No, nothing. So if it's a robust clinical trial that ticks all the boxes that you want for market authorization or part of the portfolio of market authorization for a drug, it doesn't matter if it's conducted in New York or in London.
Okay, Tony, you on the original question.
Yeah, I was going to say to Mike as well. I mean, my understanding of it is that the reason that the NHS is still trying to conduct a trial of this and trying to entice these drugs companies into paying for one and allowing their products to be used unsuccessfully so far, to the extent that there is the suggestion now that the NHS might manufacture its own cannabis oil in order to conduct a clinical trial. If it is the case that there is all of this very reputable evidence floating around that could be used in order to make a case to NICE, why do you think that NICE hasn't approved it already? Or is it just the case that, and as you were alluding to earlier, that we should sort of have some sort of exceptionalism around cannabis and say, well, we had aspirin, as you say, and we had fish oil, so maybe we could just add one more? And if so, do you not think that you have to clear a pretty high bar if you start making exceptions now when those processes already exist?
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, there's no place for exceptions. One of the key things with medical cannabis is that we have to bring the medical community with us, and so we have to treat this in exactly the same way as we treat other medicines. What I'll say is that NICE evaluated cannabis-based medicines for 4 indications last year, and approved 3 of the 4. So for subgroups of pediatric epilepsy patients, for patients with MS and multiple sclerosis, and for patients with chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, you can get medical cannabis for free on the NHS. The 4th condition that was evaluated was chronic pain, and I mentioned, it just didn't reach that cost-effectiveness threshold that it has. There are many other conditions for which there is evidence, but NICE doesn't discriminate, where trials come from. They select the highest levels of evidence, and they evaluate the medicines on that basis. What I would say is that at the moment, there are very few clinical randomized trials in progress in the UK. So in the UK, we need to bridge the gap somehow. And I don't think that we have many concerns about the safety of medical cannabis. As Michael said, the literature is pretty robust in that it's safe, but we have to go a step beyond that. Does it have efficacy, and then does it have cost effectiveness? But whilst we're in this type of situation, we really have to build up this real world evidence platform. And that's one of the things we've focused a lot about at Sapphire Clinics, that we really collect as much robust so that you can really understand how these medicines affect patients, as well as the adverse events and all the things that you would expect. But it's really key for us to collect this kind of real world evidence data at the same time, because it will inform where we're going to go over the next 5 years, for sure.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about, it's been touched on several times, the way that the stigma attached to cannabis hinders, on the political side especially, it hinders involvement, and the importance of divorcing it from the debate about the recreational use of cannabis. But of course, cannabis isn't the only product that suffers from this association. Is there, Michael, I suppose this question is for you, anyone on the panel can come back to it. Michael, is there any collaboration, or do you think there's a potential synergy between people campaigning for medical cannabis products and people campaigning, for example, for the medicinal use of or the therapeutic use of psychedelics and other substances? Is there? Do you think that medical cannabis could maybe is that a common struggle, or is there sort of no association between the 2 industries?
Between cannabis and psychedelics?
But yeah, because both of you are both cannabis and some psychedelics are both products which are stigmatized because they have a widespread illegal use, but both have a potential medical or therapeutic purpose. So I was just wondering, do you think that if the work that's being done to legitimize medicinal cannabis could make it easier, for example, for some of those other products to come online later on, or is it really a completely separate discussion?
Well, I suppose that they're broadly similar issues. It does occasionally come up. I think it comes up more in the UK, or at least has done, with some work which is being done. But we rarely see those two areas being conflated into the same argument in the United States. The bigger issue, which is what Tony was referring to earlier, is the conflation of adult use cannabis and medical cannabis into that same discussion. And that's problematic. It's very, very problematic. And the laws, as written right now in the US, I think broadly speaking, have adopted the right approach, but some of them haven't always been right. You can have a medical program in the United States like you do in California, or even in places like Arizona. But the reality is it's a very low bar to actually go in and actually purchase the products. What I will say is that the quality of products which are typically being produced under these medical programs, in almost all cases, the bar is pretty high, and you will have your license removed if you don't follow the rules. But psychedelics rarely get brought up, at least in my experience.
Okay, and so we've got several questions that kind of touch on this, and it's something we've not really gone into very much. So just before we start moving towards the conclusion, we've talked a lot about the difficulties with setting this up. We've talked a lot about the processes involved. We've talked a lot about the potential benefit for patients. But what we haven't really touched on really is the industrial side and the potential and that. So Michael, I suppose I'll start with you, and also for Rob, because there are lots of questions here about potential tax benefits of legalization, which is something that often comes up, this kind of thing. Michael, what is the potential size of this industry, do you think, if the UK got the regulatory environment right, when things have come through the process properly? What do you think this could do? How big a role do you think it could play in the UK?
So let's talk about it in the context of medical cannabis and not adult use.
Yeah, I was referring to medical cannabis. Yeah.
Yeah, and not not CBD, which again I agree with Tony. It's just it's so broadly I think dismissed now because of the false claims. Again, I think I would look at this in a very holistic way, and this is going to sound like a little bit of a blurry answer to your question. Maybe I should come out and say it's a £10 billion business and it's going to create 25,000 jobs. I look at medical cannabis through the lens of my capitalist eye as, okay, what do our sales look like? What do our margins look like? Overall, the mission of our company is to help people, and then the economics will come from that. But I think what I find particularly intriguing, and what I'd love to be able to dig deeper into, is what are the overall economic benefits to a society from actually doing this? And that's something which I think can be far greater than just simply the top line revenue number. If people are actually able to function in their homes. I mean, Charlotte, for example, is just a perfect example here of someone who has literally 24/7 had to look after somebody who now has a drug that actually, I'm knocking wood here, Charlotte, is enabling your lovely son to be able to function somewhat normally now, which probably allows you to be able to not always have to be around him 24/7. And if you extrapolate this out, the caregivers that actually have to look after people who then become better, if you think about people getting back to work and being productive members of society. So it's a very good question. I can't give you a precise answer. I just know that in states and in societies where this has been adopted and where it has had an improvement on people's lives and those caregivers around them, it has a multiplying effect. But I don't want to be on record as saying this is the number.
No.
The fact that I think it's a very big sociological. It's a very big number from a number of different vantage points.
Okay, perfect. Well, you used holistic and I used synergy, so I think that we've probably hit panel bingo. Rob, in your role as a political advocate for reform of drug policy, in your experience, what are the most effective arguments when trying to drive change? Because as you said, an awful lot of politicians are quite reluctant, especially in the Conservative Party. There's a lot of conflation or fear of conflation with recreational use. So relatively briefly, because I think we're moving toward, but in your experience, what are the most effective messages? What are the best arguments?
I think there are three. Firstly is making sure the drugs are safe. Secondly, separating the arguments between recreational and medical cannabis. And thirdly, economic arguments. Now, we've just been talking about some of those, but for example, an industry that works well could create thousands of new jobs with all the tax implications that has with it. It also would create a new part of the R&D expertise that the UK has, and it's that is an area which will have high quality jobs long into the future, and that's what an economy moving out of the European Union is going to want to see. It will allow for wealth creators and entrepreneurs to move into the market. And also, I mean, the last point that was made about getting people back to work, I mean, I have actually seen that myself. I've seen somebody who was in huge amount of pain take medical cannabis for pain and go fully back into work properly. And there are numerous examples of that. Unfortunately, you've got to make sure that the data on those things are properly categorized and shown to be true on a wide enough scale for NICE or whoever to accept it. So the arguments are difficult, but with a well-coordinated industry, they could be made.
Okay, a quick question for Dr. Södergren. I've had a question. There are a few questions in here. Given that we've talked about the delays and the time involved in getting these things done properly, in your view, I know obviously this won't be a definitive statement, but what's the rough timeline, do you think, before these products start being prescribed broadly on the NHS in this country?
Well, as I said, for 3 of the 4 indications that were evaluated, NICE ruled in favor. But the big one is pain. So that's going to be the largest volume of patients. And then there are several other smaller indications. And I think some psychiatric ones like anxiety also have quite a large volume of patients. So it's not one point where we say cannabis-based medicines are on the NHS. It will be now at this point, based on our evaluation, or the evaluation of NICE, we feel that it should be available for chronic pain, for instance. And so I think that, within the next 5 to 10 years, definitely within the next 10 years, we're going to have ironed out the big indications, and we'll have a good evidence base to be able to guide what's going to be effective as treatments and whether they should be available on the NHS.
Okay, and I think this will probably be the last question before we go into closing statements, and this is for, I guess, whoever in the panel, because you all have different perspectives on it. What are the chances that we could achieve a proper consultation between the government and clinicians to try and hammer out properly what needs to be done to educate clinicians properly, because we've talked about the fact that a lot of clinicians aren't receiving proper training, and to ensure that the data collection is happening? We've discussed a lot of the problems. What would the government need to do? What would a consultation look like that would find the answers as quickly as possible?
I can, I suppose, answer that relatively quickly. So, I mean, I think that there was a motivation from the government. So we met with Matt Hancock earlier this year, who I do think did feel that he wanted to get something done around this. However, after COVID, I think understandably no attention at all has been given to anything other than COVID, and I think this is a little bit lower down on the list of priorities. But I don't think it's going to take much to revive those talks. And we had many industry representatives around that table, and there was appeared to be a genuine will to at least be able to help some of the patients who we see are suffering greatly because of the current situation.
Okay, so we're going to move to closing remarks now. If each of you could just take a few minutes to offer your thoughts on the discussion, any of the issues raised, anything that you'd like our audience at home to take away. I'm basically going to go through this in reverse order from how we started. So we'll start with Charlotte, then Dr. Sodergren, and so on and so forth. So Charlotte, we could start with you.
Yeah, for me, it's a no-brainer. Really, is world clinical trials, global clinical trials. Those products that are being used and have demonstrated and been successful, published papers, bring it. Those brought to the UK, and I think or private clinics start collecting the data on patients that they are now prescribing for. But I also think this needs to be headed up by, as I said, some sort of task force within the government, where they're not only looking at the data for private prescriptions, they're looking at the data for people who grow their own medicine, and also the people who are accessing it from the black market. I would also like to say now is the time. I truly believe, especially with the COVID, now is the time for the NHS, not only for the government to improve, the financial well-being of the NHS, but the well-being of our nation.
Okay, Dr. Sodergren.
Thank you. So, I think that the problems that we see around getting patients access to medical cannabis are pretty transparent. And, we set up Sapphire Medical Clinics with a view to solving those through getting the data that we need to be able to support prescriptions that in the end are going to be on the NHS. It's a long process, but I think that the government can do several things to try to boost it, in that some of the timelines around the traditional funding can be shortened. They can be this area can be prioritized as an area of research. And the suggestion that a government-sponsored center that essentially pools all the expertise, that is something that is very welcome. And I think there have been preliminary discussions within the CMC to look at how this can be made reality. Finally, what I would say is that, there are some educational resources, and, I'll plug one of our free educational resource for both healthcare clinicians and patients is the Sapphire Institute for Medical Cannabis Education, completely free. You can read about what medical cannabis does, and if you're a clinician, you can get yourself educated in prescribing too.
Okay, Tony.
Yeah, I think all of this discussion of some sort of government task force or board of experts is a really interesting one, and I think that might be a good place for the government to start in looking at these things. I think that the issues that I raised at the beginning, which other people have raised about the public understanding of what we're really talking about here, will continue to feed political will, because obviously concerns about public reaction to any liberalization of this stuff potentially holds things up on the government end. I think that we are starting to see better access. We're seeing, although Billy has taken a very circuitous route to getting any access to cannabis, Charlotte, he is not the only one, and there are other people who are going through the sort of various workaround systems that the NHS and the government has created. So I think on the access front, we will sort of slowly break down the dam, and people will start getting prescribed more, and that probably has an effect on public consciousness as well. In terms of funding, I think you obviously need buy-in from these companies, and quite what the government can do about that, I'm not sure. This is not my area, but yeah, it's probably also worth saying, given this is a fairly niche topic, and that we've got lots of people who are interested in it watching, that I'm always interested in hearing from people who've got different perspectives on this. And there are patients, and there are people in politics, and there are people in business, that I'd be very interested to chat to any of those people if they wanted to contact me.
Excellent. Michael.
Thank you. It's a multi-legged solution. I think it has to be a public-private partnership. Companies like ours, other companies, have to be willing, as we are, to devote time, energy, effort, and money to working with policymakers to educate them, to allow them to understand that there are places in the world where these programs have been put in place and they have worked. And I think as importantly for any politician, to make sure that you're ensuring that they don't look silly. And so you identify the mistakes were made, and you make sure that they're not made in a program which is implemented. So I think the public-private side to this is critically important, and the CMC has played an incredible role in such a short period of time, you know, along with people like Charlotte. And I'd also just like to give a big shout out to all the journalists, you know, whether it's Ian Birrell or you, Tony, or others who've just done a brilliant job of that, raising the consciousness of this and just hammering away at it day in and day out. And we really owe you a great deal of gratitude for that. The piece of this which, again, most intrigues me is how do we thread the needle with, you know, the wonderful doctors like Dr. Sogren and, you know, Philip Maguire at King's College, who's doing epilepsy research, and Oren Davinsky and others. How do we make sure that we have your trust in building products that actually have proper safety protocols? They work for the specific use cases. And then, you know, we have an economic argument that can support that. So there's lots there to bring together. But, you know, I think this has been a wonderful representation, I think, on this panel of all of those different constituents. So let's just keep at it.
Thank you. And Robert. Rob.
Thanks. Look, I come from the position that if heroin and cocaine can be used medically, as they are, there's no reason why medical cannabis can't be used to help people with their problems. There is clearly the basis for a very strong and productive market in the UK and elsewhere that could be extremely beneficial long term to the UK. I slightly worry that the NIHR has had no trials, as far as I'm aware, having offered money to get involved in clinical trials. None of them seem to have been taken up or at least approved at any rate. That is a concern. But the big thing this needs is it needs the industry to really grow up and step up and accept that these rules, these regulations are in place for good reason and they must be adhered to. So what we need is to try and offer a partnership approach, to come together as an industry and offer a partnership approach to the government and to the research and development sector in the UK, particularly universities, to try and fund more clinical trials, to get more drugs on the market that are licensed going forward.
Thank you very much. Now, this is usually the point of the evening where I'd invite the audience to give everyone a round of applause. There is none, but I hope that I will do. Sometimes with these panels, we're covering really quite technical issues. I think I've certainly learned a lot. It's been hugely enjoyable, and I'm sure that I speak for all of our viewers at home when I say that this has been a hugely informative panel. Thank you so much to all of you for taking the time to speak to us this evening. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in at home. Obviously, this is a slightly late one, but I hope it was worth it. I certainly thought it was. This is the last Conservative Home event for today, but we are running a full suite of events tomorrow, so please do tune back in then and join us again. Again, final thank you to our panel, and I'll bid you all good evening.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you.
having me.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.